Plato. More than 2,000 years ago, a man named Plato asked one of the most unsettling questions in history. What if everything you think is real is just a shadow? To explain this, Plato told a story, one that still feels strangely familiar today. Imagine people living in a dark cave. They've been there since birth, chained so they can't move their heads. All they can see is a blank wall in front of them. Behind them is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people walk by holding up objects. The light from the fire casts shadows of these objects onto the wall. The prisoners don't see the people or the fire, they only see the shadows, and they think the shadows are reality. Now imagine one prisoner breaks free. At first he's blinded by the light, but slowly his eyes adjust. He sees the fire, the people, and eventually he climbs out of the cave entirely and sees the real world, trees, mountains, the sun. For the first time he sees things as they truly are. That's Plato's allegory of the cave. And it's not just a weird story, it's a picture of us. Plato believed that most people live like the prisoners, surrounded by illusions, believing whatever their senses show them, never questioning whether it's the whole truth. To him, the world we see with our eyes is only a rough copy of something deeper and more real. Let's say you see a beautiful painting. Plato would say, "That's nice, but it's just a copy of the idea of beauty. The real thing exists somewhere beyond what we can see." The same goes for justice, truth, even a perfect circle. We've seen versions of these things, but never their pure, perfect form. Plato called these the forms, invisible, unchanging ideals that exist beyond the physical world. Most of us, he said, are stuck chasing appearances. We think fame, money, or good looks will make us happy. But these things fade. They're shadows on the wall. Real wisdom comes from looking beyond them, from using our minds, not just our eyes. And this brings us to something even more disturbing. In Plato's story, when the freed prisoner returns to the cave to tell the others what he saw, they don't believe him. In fact, they get angry. They're comfortable with the shadows. The truth is too painful. They would rather stay in the dark. Plato saw this happen in real life. His teacher Socrates was executed in Athens for asking difficult questions and challenging people's beliefs. For Plato, it was proof that many people don't want to be awakened. They want to believe the version of reality that makes them feel safe. So Plato made a bold suggestion. Maybe the people who should lead society aren't the richest or loudest, but the ones who have seen beyond the cave. Philosophers. People trained not just in knowledge, but in wisdom. Those who seek truth, even when it's uncomfortable. That idea still sparks debate. But it points to something important. Plato didn't just care about what's real. He cared about how dangerous false beliefs can be. And in today's world, filled with fake news, filtered images, and carefully curated lives, his cave feels more relevant than ever. Are we really seeing the world as it is? Or are we staring at shadows on a screen? Plato's challenge is timeless. Don't settle for what's in front of you. Don't believe something just because it's familiar. Use your mind. Ask better questions. Go deeper. You don't have to become a philosopher, but you should ask yourself this: what if you're still in the cave and just don't know it yet? Socrates didn't write books. He didn't call himself a teacher. He didn't even offer answers. Instead, he walked barefoot through the streets of ancient Athens, stopping strangers to ask them the kind of questions most people go their whole lives avoiding. What is justice? What is love? What is a good life? To the average person, these might seem obvious, but to Socrates, what mattered wasn't how quickly you answered, it was how well your answer held up under pressure. Take this one day. He might ask a respected general, "What is courage?" The general might say, "It's standing your ground in battle." Socrates would nod, then ask, "But what if standing your ground is foolish, like against overwhelming odds? Then is running away ever courageous if it protects your soldiers?" And finally, so is courage doing what's right, even if it doesn't look brave. By the end, the general might realize he'd never really thought about it. That was the point. Socrates believed most people lived on autopilot, repeating ideas they'd heard but never examined. So he poked at the cracks. not to humiliate, but to awaken. He often spoke with young men from wealthy families, including Plato, who later became his student and recorded many of these conversations. In one dialogue, Socrates questions Euthyphro, a man who claims to understand piety, what pleases the gods. Euthyphro is about to prosecute his own father for murder, confident he knows what the gods demand. Socrates stops him and asks, is something holy because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is holy? That one question creates a problem that theologians and philosophers are still debating today. If the gods love something because it's already holy, then morality exists beyond them. But if it's holy only because they love it, then morality is arbitrary. This wasn't about winning arguments. Socrates wanted people to think deeply, not defensively, and he didn't only target big ideas like morality or justice. He might ask someone in the market, what is family? And when they say parents and children, he might reply, what about adopted children? Or friends who raise you better than your parents? The deeper the conversation went, the more flexible and complicated the concept became. Most people don't think that hard, and some don't want to. To those in power, Socrates became a threat. His questions embarrassed politicians. His influence over young people worried traditionalists. He refused to flatter. He didn't fear authority. And eventually, Athens had enough. He was put on trial for corrupting the youth and failing to honor the city's gods. But everyone knew the real reason he made people uncomfortable. He was given a chance to flee or beg for mercy. He did neither. Instead, he stood before the jury and said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And so at age 70, Socrates was executed, drinking a cup of hemlock surrounded by his friends. But here's what makes that moment more than just tragic. Socrates had spent his life teaching people how to die by teaching them how to live without illusion. To him, death wasn't the worst thing. Living without questioning, without thinking, without caring whether what you believed was true, that was worse. His method, now called the Socratic method, is still used in schools and law courts today. It's a way of testing ideas through questioning, instead of just accepting them. But more than that, it's a mindset. It's being willing to say, I don't know, but let's find out. Socrates didn't just change philosophy, he changed what it means to be alive, to live with doubt, with humility, and with relentless curiosity. Aristotle. If Plato was the dreamer, the man who believed reality was hidden in some perfect, invisible realm, then Aristotle was the one who came down to earth. He was Plato's student, but he didn't agree with him. To Aristotle, there was no need to escape the world to find truth. The world itself was already full of it. You just had to look closely and organize what you saw. That's exactly what he did. Aristotle tried to map everything: biology, logic, ethics, astronomy, politics, poetry. No subject was too big or too small. He studied seashells and stars, emotions and governments. He dissected animals and invented syllogisms. He asked what makes a tragedy work and what makes a city just a year. Imagine a man so curious, so systematic, that he tried to categorize all knowledge, from the shape of a bird's beak to the purpose of human life. That was Aristotle. His approach was radically different from Plato's. Plato believed in ideal forms, perfect versions of everything that existed somewhere beyond our reach. But Aristotle thought, why imagine a separate world when we have this one? He believed the truth of something wasn't hidden away. It was found by observing what it actually does. Take a knife. What makes it a knife? Its shape, its material. Aristotle would say it's a knife because of its purpose. To cut that idea, that everything has a purpose, a reason for being what it is, became central to his philosophy. He called it telos, the end, the goal. For a knife, it's to cut. For a seed, it's to grow into a tree. And for a human being, it's to reason, to think well, to live wisely. Aristotle believed that everything has four causes, four explanations for why it exists the way it does. So if you're looking at a statue, Aristotle would say you need to ask four questions. First, What is it made of? That's the material cause. In this case, marble. Second, what shape does it take? That's the formal cause. Maybe it's carved to look like a human. Third, who made it? That's the efficient cause, the sculptor. And finally, why was it made? That's the final cause. Maybe it was created to honor a god. To truly understand anything, Aristotle believed, you need all four. This four-part lens let him analyze anything. Not just objects, but nature, behavior, even ethics. And when it came to ethics, Aristotle wasn't interested in abstract rules. He asked a much more practical question. What kind of person should I become? He believed that happiness, real, lasting happiness, comes from virtue. And virtue isn't a feeling, it's a habit. You become brave by practicing courage. You become just by doing just things. It's not about being perfect, it's about aiming for the golden mean, the balance point between extremes. Let's take the example of fear. If you have too little fear, you act recklessly, like jumping off a cliff without looking. If you have too much fear, you freeze. You never take a risk even when you should. But if you find the right balance, not too much, not too little, that's courage. And that's what Aristotle called the golden mean, the sweet spot between extremes. To Aristotle, a good life isn't about pleasure or wealth or even success. It's about flourishing, becoming the best version of yourself by living in harmony with reason, habit, and purpose. He didn't just theorize. He advised kings. He founded a school. He walked and taught at the same time, earning his students the name peripatetics, meaning those who walk around, and his work stuck. His writings shaped science and logic for over 1,000 years. For centuries, people thought if Aristotle said it, it must be true. Of course, not all of his ideas aged well. He got a lot of things wrong, about physics, about women, about slavery. But what matters is how he thought, slowly, carefully, methodically. Always starting from observation. Always asking, what is this thing really for? Today, we live in a world overflowing with data, information everywhere, and it can feel overwhelming, meaningless. Aristotle reminds us that knowledge isn't just about collecting facts, it's about finding structure, finding purpose, asking not just what things are, but why they matter. He took the chaos of the world and started sorting it, one question at a time. In a sense, we're still walking behind him. Descartes. Most people wake up in the morning and assume the world is real. René Descartes didn't. He woke up and asked, how do I know anything at all is true? How do I know I'm not dreaming right now? What if my entire life, the people, the sky, the ground beneath me, is just a trick? This wasn't science fiction. This was philosophy. And Descartes took it seriously. Born in 1596, Descartes lived during a time when the old certainties were crumbling. Medieval beliefs were giving way to new discoveries. People were looking through telescopes, dissecting bodies, challenging the authority of the church. Truth suddenly seemed fragile. Descartes wanted to rebuild certainty from the ground up. But to do that, he first had to tear everything down. He began by doubting everything. Can I trust my senses? Well, no. I've seen straight lines bend in water. I've seen dreams that felt completely real. My senses can be fooled. Can I trust logic or math? Even that, he said, might be a trick. Maybe there's some powerful being, a deceiver, feeding me false ideas, making 2 + 2 feel like 4 when it isn't. It sounds paranoid, but Descartes wasn't trying to lose himself. He was trying to find the one thing he couldn't doubt. And finally, he found it. Even if everything is an illusion, even if there's a deceiver controlling my thoughts, there must still be a me doing the thinking. That's where his most famous phrase comes in. I think, therefore I am. In Latin, cogito, ergo sum. It's simple, but it shook the world. Descartes wasn't saying that thinking proves you're alive in a physical sense. He was saying, even if I can't trust my body, or my memories, or the world around me, the fact that I'm doubting, that I'm asking these questions, proves I exist as a thinking thing. That became his foundation. From that one solid point, I exist, he tried to rebuild knowledge. He believed reason, not tradition or senses, was the key to truth. And from reason, he built arguments for everything, including the existence of God, the separation of mind and body, and the laws of nature. You may not agree with all of it, but the method mattered. It was a turning point, the idea that you shouldn't accept anything as true unless you've thought it through for yourself. That's where modern philosophy begins, and in many ways where modern science begins too. Descartes was also a mathematician. He invented Cartesian coordinates, the grid system behind modern graphs. If you've ever seen an X and Y axis, you've used Descartes' invention. To him, math was the model of clarity. He dreamed of making all knowledge as precise and logical as geometry. But not everyone liked his sharp divide between mind and body. Descartes believed your mind, the thinking self, was entirely separate from your body, the physical machine. To him, your thoughts, memories, and consciousness belonged to a non-material realm. Your body? That was just matter in motion. But this split raised a tough question. If the mind is separate from the body, how do they interact? He struggled to answer that, and it's still a major puzzle today in philosophy and neuroscience. But maybe the most powerful part of Descartes' work wasn't his theories, it was his method. Doubt everything. Question everything. Don't settle until it makes sense to you. It's not about being cynical. It's about clearing away noise, pressure, assumption, until you find something solid. In today's world, where opinions spread faster than facts, where illusions flood our screens, and where even truth feels up for debate, Descartes' approach is more important than ever. Ask the hard question. Pause before accepting the easy answer. Be willing to admit, I don't know yet. That's where real thinking begins. David Hume. Most of the time we don't question how we understand the world. We see things happen, we notice patterns, and we assume this causes that. Lightning flashes, thunder follows. A match strikes, fire appears. Easy, right? Not for David Hume. Hume, an 18th century Scottish philosopher, looked at something as basic as cause and effect and ripped it apart. He started with a bold question. How do you really know one thing causes another? Most people would say, because I've seen it happen before. But Hume wasn't satisfied with that. Just because two things happen together, he said, doesn't mean one causes the other. Take this example. Every morning the sun rises after the rooster crows. But no one believes the rooster causes the sun to rise. So why do we believe that fire causes heat, or that gravity pulls things down? Hume's answer: we don't actually know. We expect. All we really have is habit, a mental association formed by repeated experience. When A follows B again and again, our brains link them. But the actual necessary connection between them, that's something we've never seen. It's just assumed. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Hume's skepticism didn't stop at cause and effect. He went after the self too. You might say, I know who I am. But Hume asked, when you look inward, what exactly do you find? He claimed that when he examined his own thoughts, he didn't discover a solid self. He just found a stream of impressions, feelings, ideas, sensations, memories, constantly shifting. No unchanging soul, no deep fixed identity, just a bundle of perceptions tied together by habit and memory. It was unsettling then. It's still unsettling now. But here's the twist. Hume wasn't a nihilist. He didn't think life was meaningless. He just thought we should be honest about how little we actually know for sure. So how do we live with that uncertainty? Well, Hume did something surprisingly human. He said we live by instinct. We believe in cause and effect because it works, not because we've proven it. We trust our memories, our reasoning, our sense of identity, not because they're flawless, but because we have nothing else to go on. He accepted that reason has limits, and beyond those limits, we rely on experience, emotion, and custom to navigate the world. In fact, Hume believed emotion plays a far bigger role in human thinking than most philosophers were willing to admit. You don't make moral choices based purely on logic, he said. You respond emotionally first, and then your brain tries to justify it afterward. Sound familiar? In a world flooded with information and emotional triggers, Hume's insight feels more relevant than ever. We like to think we're rational creatures, weighing evidence, making calm decisions. But often we're just finding clever ways to justify what we already feel. Even science, which we hold up as the gold standard of reason, is built on habits of expectation. No scientist has proven that the future will always behave like the past. They just assume it will, because it has so far. And that's the genius of Hume. He exposed how much of our confidence in ourselves, in truth, in knowledge, rests not on certainty, but on patterns that feel reliable. You might think that would make people hate his ideas. And many did. But others, like Kant, were shaken awake by Hume's work. Kant, said Hume, interrupted my dogmatic slumber. It forced him, and generations of thinkers after, to rethink the foundations of philosophy. So if you ever find yourself questioning the obvious, wondering whether you're just going along with what seems normal, whether your beliefs are based on truth or just repetition, you're not lost. You're thinking like Hume. Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal was a prodigy. By the time he was a teenager, he was designing early calculators and laying the groundwork for probability theory. He was sharp, logical, brilliant. But what made him truly fascinating wasn't his intellect, it was his fear. Fear of death, fear of silence, fear of what comes after. Pascal lived in 17th century France, a time when science was rapidly changing the world, but religion still ruled much of life. He was caught in the middle, a scientist who couldn't shake his belief in God, and a believer who couldn't ignore the power of reason. He didn't try to make peace between the two. He let the tension sit, raw and unresolved. And out of that tension came one of the strangest and most famous arguments in philosophy, Pascal's wager. It goes like this. Let's say you don't know whether God exists. You're not certain one way or the other. Pascal says treat it like a bet. If you believe in God, and God exists, you win everything, eternal happiness. If you believe, and God doesn't exist, you lose very little. But if you don't believe, and God does exist, you risk infinite loss. If you don't believe, and you're right, well, again, not much happens. So the logical move, bet on belief. Pascal wasn't saying that faith is proven by reason. He was saying, in a world full of uncertainty, sometimes the smartest choice is the safest one. Some people hate that argument. It feels cold, like gambling with your soul. But Pascal wasn't trying to trick you into belief. He was trying to meet the modern mind where it stood, in doubt, in silence, in fear. Because underneath his logic was something far more personal, a sense of spiritual panic. In his notes, found after his death, Pascal wrote, "When I consider the short duration of my life, swallowed up in the eternity before and after, the silence of those infinite spaces terrifies me." That line, "the silence of infinite spaces terrifies me," might be one of the most haunting sentences in all of philosophy. Pascal saw a world that was enormous, mechanical, and indifferent. He saw a universe that didn't speak. And yet, he believed. But he also knew belief didn't come easily. He understood how distracted we are, how we fill our days with entertainment, work, noise, anything to avoid confronting our mortality. Pascal thought this wasn't just a habit. It was a spiritual strategy. We distract ourselves, not because we're bored, but because we're afraid. Afraid to ask the hard questions. Why am I here? What happens when I die? What if there's something or someone beyond all of this? Pascal wasn't preaching. He was pleading. He wanted people to stop running from the silence and sit with it, to stare into the vast unknown and ask what might be waiting there. He believed reason alone couldn't take you all the way to truth. It could carry you to the edge. But faith begins where reason ends. That doesn't mean blind faith. For Pascal, faith was a leap, but not a reckless one. It was a gamble with eyes open, a wager made in full awareness of the risks. And maybe that's what makes his thought so powerful. He didn't offer comfort, he offered a mirror. He saw human beings as both great and miserable, capable of noble acts and selfish ones, able to build cathedrals and destroy them. He believed we are caught between the angel and the animal, always torn between meaning and madness. He wasn't trying to convince you of anything. He was just pointing to the silence and asking if you'd dare to listen. Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche didn't want to comfort you. He didn't believe in safety. He believed in shaking the ground beneath your feet. Born in 1844 in Germany, Nietzsche grew up in a deeply religious household. His father was a Lutheran pastor. But by the time Nietzsche began writing, he wasn't preaching faith. He was pronouncing its death. One of his most famous lines was, "God is dead." It's been misunderstood ever since. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't mocking religion. He was diagnosing a crisis. By the late 1800s, science had begun replacing theology. People stopped turning to the Bible for answers about the stars, the earth, even the human mind. The authority of religion was fading, but nothing had taken its place. That, Nietzsche thought, was dangerous. When he said God is dead, he meant that the belief in God and the moral structure that came with it was collapsing. And with it, our shared sense of meaning, purpose, and morality was beginning to rot. Nietzsche saw it before most others did. And he asked, if we no longer believe in God, what do we believe in now? What fills the vacuum? He feared that without a higher meaning to guide us, society would slip into nihilism, the belief that nothing matters, nothing is true, nothing is worth striving for. He compared it to a sickness of the soul. And he thought the danger wasn't just despair, it was mediocrity. In a world without higher purpose, people would settle for comfort, security, and sameness, what he called the last man. A person who doesn't strive, doesn't risk, doesn't dream, just consumes, scrolls, and sleeps. Nietzsche's response wasn't to mourn the past, it was to challenge us to create something better. He called for the rise of the Übermensch, often translated as the overman or the higher man. Not a supervillain, not a master race, but someone who creates their own values, who lives with intensity and purpose, who makes meaning out of chaos. The Übermensch doesn't need a ready-made system. He shapes himself like an artist shapes a sculpture. He doesn't ask, what should I do? He asks, what am I becoming? This wasn't about being selfish or cruel. Nietzsche admired strength, but he despised cruelty. He wasn't saying, do whatever you want. He was saying, don't live a borrowed life. But it wasn't easy advice. Nietzsche knew it came with a cost. He wrote about the eternal recurrence, a thought experiment to test your life. He asked, what if, right now, a voice told you that you'd have to live this life again and again, forever? Every pain, every joy, every moment, exactly the same. Would you curse it, or would you say, yes, I choose this? Again, and again, and again. If that idea horrifies you, maybe you're not living the life you truly want. If it excites you, maybe you're close. Nietzsche lived in constant pain, both physical and mental. He was often alone, misunderstood, and eventually descended into madness. But his writing was never passive. It burned. He wanted to wake people up, even if it meant disturbing them. He wrote, he who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. That line has helped people through war, prison, and despair. Because Nietzsche didn't just tear things down, he demanded that we build something worthy in their place. He knew the truth could be brutal, but he believed it was better to face it than to live in illusion. He wanted life to be raw, real, intense, not comfortable, but meaningful. And maybe that's the question he leaves us with. If nothing is handed to you, no script, no rules, no final answer, what do you do with your freedom? Søren Kierkegaard. Most people think of faith as comforting. Søren Kierkegaard didn't. To him, real faith wasn't about sitting quietly in a pew or repeating a prayer from memory. It was a leap. A terrifying, irrational leap made in the dark, with no guarantees. Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen in 1813. He was a Christian, but not the kind people were used to. At the time, Denmark had a state church. Christianity was official, orderly, cultural. Everyone was Christian, by default. Kierkegaard hated that. He thought the comfortable version of faith people practiced was hollow, just going through motions. He didn't want religion that asked nothing, demanded nothing, risked nothing. He wanted something real, and that meant doubt, struggle, even despair. He believed that becoming a real individual, a true self, required facing life's most disturbing truths, that we are free, that we are responsible, and that we don't get certainty. He called this state of mind angst. Angst isn't ordinary fear. It's deeper, the feeling you get when you stand on the edge of a cliff and realize nothing is stopping you from jumping. That's the burden of human freedom. You're not held back by fate. You're not locked into a role. You choose, and with every choice, you become something, or you don't. Kierkegaard saw that as both terrifying and essential. He gave us one of the most vivid pictures of what that choice looks like. The story of Abraham. In the Bible, Abraham is asked by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. It's a horrifying request. It makes no rational sense. And yet, Abraham obeys, without explanation, without certainty, without proof. At the last moment, God stops him. To Kierkegaard, this wasn't a story about blind obedience. It was about the paradox of faith, that you're asked to act beyond reason, to trust something that feels impossible. He called Abraham a knight of faith, not because he was sure, but because he moved forward despite the absurdity of the situation. And that's the key. Kierkegaard thought real faith requires you to leap across a gap that reason can't bridge. You don't get a map, you don't get confirmation, you get anxiety, risk, and then the leap. If that makes you uncomfortable, you're not alone. Kierkegaard made people deeply uncomfortable, including himself. He broke off his engagement to the woman he loved because he believed his own emotional torment would ruin her life. He isolated himself. He poured his anguish into books under strange pseudonyms, each voice representing a different part of the human experience. The aesthetic, the ethical, the religious. The aesthetic life is about pleasure, art, escape. The ethical life is about responsibility, duty, doing what's right. The religious life is something else entirely. It begins where logic and ethics fall apart. Kierkegaard didn't say one path was easy. In fact, he believed that despair lurks in all of them. He wrote that most people live in despair without knowing it, trapped in distractions, trying to avoid the terrifying fact that their life has no real center. To escape that despair, you don't just believe, you have to choose. You have to confront the absurd and leap anyway. That's what makes Kierkegaard the father of existentialism, even though he never used that word. He laid the foundation for thinkers like Sartre and Camus by insisting that human existence is defined by anxiety, freedom, and choice. He saw life not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a question to be lived. Not everyone wants to live with that much honesty. Most of us prefer certainty, comfort, or at least the illusion of it. But Kierkegaard wasn't interested in comforting illusions. He wanted the real thing, even if it hurt. So if you've ever stood in front of a big decision and felt sick with fear, if you've ever stared into the silence waiting for an answer that doesn't come, if you've ever believed in something without being able to explain why, you're not broken. You're human. And Kierkegaard would say, you're finally getting somewhere. Arthur Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer didn't sugarcoat anything. He looked at life, stripped of illusion, and saw one thing: suffering. Born in 1788 in Germany, Schopenhauer was a pessimist in the truest sense. He believed that at the core of human existence was a force, blind, relentless, and irrational, that drives all life forward. He called it the will. Not willpower, not intention, but a kind of raw, restless energy that lives underneath everything. It's the force that causes animals to hunt, plants to grow, people to desire, struggle, fight, and cling to life. And the problem with this will, it never stops. It never gets satisfied. You want something, love, success, a new phone, whatever. You chase it. You might even get it. And then what? A brief moment of relief, and a new desire takes its place. Schopenhauer saw this cycle everywhere. He wrote, life swings like a pendulum backward and forward between pain and boredom. Either we're suffering because we lack something, or we're bored because we have it and don't know what to do next. That view made him unpopular. While others spoke of progress, morality, or human greatness, Schopenhauer basically said, we're trapped in a loop of craving and disappointment, and the universe doesn't care. But strangely, that wasn't the end of his message. Because if desire is the source of suffering, he asked, is there a way to escape it? For Schopenhauer, the answer was yes, through moments where we temporarily break free from the grip of the will. And those moments come through aesthetic experience, art, music, beauty, contemplation. Imagine standing in front of a painting and forgetting your problems, or listening to a piece of music so moving that you lose track of yourself, or getting absorbed in nature, the movement of waves, the shape of a tree, with no goal, no need, just stillness. In those moments, Schopenhauer believed, the will is silenced. You're no longer a wanting creature, you're just aware, just present. That, to him, was the closest thing to peace. And while other philosophers praised reason, Schopenhauer elevated art, especially music. He believed music was a direct expression of the will, not a copy of reality, but the thing itself, vibrating through time. That's why it moves us so deeply, so mysteriously. He also had deep sympathy for animals. While most of his peers thought humans were superior, Schopenhauer saw animals as fellow sufferers, beings pulled by the same blind force. He was one of the first major Western philosophers to argue for compassion toward animals, long before it was popular. And speaking of compassion, despite his bleak view of life, Schopenhauer saw ethics not as a set of rules, but as an instinctive emotional connection. When you see someone in pain and feel it as if it were your own, that's compassion. And in that moment, the illusion of separation breaks down. Because deep down, he thought, we're all the same thing, all expressions of the same struggling will. Compassion is the glimpse of that truth. But make no mistake, Schopenhauer didn't think we could fix the world. He didn't believe in utopias. He didn't believe suffering would end through politics, progress, or religion. What he offered instead was something quieter, humbler, and maybe more honest. Face the truth, see suffering clearly, and find brief peace in beauty, in kindness, in letting go of endless wanting. Schopenhauer didn't inspire revolutions. He didn't build systems, but he influenced artists, writers, and even psychologists, people like Nietzsche, Freud, Tolstoy, Wagner, and Beckett, all of whom saw the same dark truth he did and tried to turn it into something bearable. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by wanting, by pressure, by the absurd repetition of it all, stop. Step outside it. Listen to music. Look at something beautiful, not to own it, not to explain it, just to be with it. In that moment, you might find what Schopenhauer called a brief release from the tyranny of the will. Not a solution, but a breath. And sometimes, that's enough. Fyodor Dostoevsky. If there's one philosopher who truly understood what it feels like to be at war with yourself, it was Fyodor Dostoevsky. He wasn't a traditional philosopher. He didn't write treatises or formal arguments, but through his novels he explored the darkest corners of the human soul. Guilt, freedom, faith, madness. No one captured the depth of our inner lives like he did. And the reason might be because he lived it. Dostoevsky was born in Russia in 1821. Early in his life, he was arrested for political activity and sentenced to death. He stood in front of a firing squad. Seconds before they pulled the trigger, a messenger arrived. The execution was a fake, a punishment designed to break him. Instead of death, he was sent to a Siberian labor camp for 4 years. He lived among criminals, murderers, and outcasts. There was no escape. He called it hell on earth. And yet, in that place, he began to see people more clearly than ever. He saw that no one is purely good or purely evil. Every person contains contradictions, impulses, self-justifications, secret hopes, and quiet despair. He brought that vision into his writing. In Crime and Punishment, a poor student named Raskolnikov convinces himself that morality is relative, that some people are so important they're allowed to break the rules. He kills a pawnbroker, telling himself it's for a greater good, but the guilt eats him alive. What Dostoevsky shows isn't just that murder is wrong. That's obvious. He shows how terrifying it is to believe there's no higher law at all, and that you must decide everything for yourself, with no safety net, no God, no structure to lean on. That's the real punishment. Dostoevsky understood freedom not as liberation, but as a burden. What do you do when no one is watching? What if you're free to do anything, but also responsible for everything? This comes up again in The Brothers Karamazov, where one character tells the famous line, "If God is dead, then everything is permitted." But Dostoevsky didn't stop at that line. He asked, if everything is permitted, can we handle that, or do we end up building prisons for ourselves, mental, emotional, or even spiritual, to avoid that crushing weight? He believed human beings crave meaning, and when they don't find it, they fall apart. Or worse, build systems of control to fill the void. In The Grand Inquisitor, a parable told within the novel, Jesus returns during the Spanish Inquisition. But instead of being celebrated, he's arrested by church authorities. Why? Because they say you gave people too much freedom. People don't want truth. They want comfort. They'd rather be controlled than have to choose. It's a brutal critique, not just of religion, but of humanity itself. Dostoevsky wasn't a cynic, though. He didn't believe humans were doomed, but he refused to look away from the mess. He knew people could be cruel, petty, violent, and yet also capable of profound love, sacrifice, and forgiveness. He believed in redemption, but not the cheap kind. To be redeemed, you had to suffer. You had to face the worst in yourself and come out the other side, humbled, cracked open, transformed. He believed suffering wasn't just something to avoid, it was sometimes the only thing that could wake you up. He once wrote, "The mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for." And that's where Dostoevsky differs from pure philosophers. He didn't offer a system. He offered stories, complex, messy, terrifying stories that mirror the chaos inside us. Because for him, philosophy wasn't something you read. It was something you lived. And if you've ever felt like two different people inside one body, one side righteous, the other side sabotaging everything, if you've ever rationalized something you knew was wrong, or clung to faith while drowning in doubt, you're not alone. Dostoevsky was already there, writing in the dark, trying to make sense of it all, not by simplifying the human soul, but by diving straight into its contradictions. And somehow, he made it feel like a mirror. Sigmund Freud. Imagine waking up one day and realizing you're not in charge of yourself. Not really. Your thoughts, your feelings, the words that slip out, the dreams that haunt you, the sudden anger, the strange attractions, they're not entirely under your control. They're coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere hidden. That's what Sigmund Freud believed. Born in 1856 in what's now the Czech Republic, Freud was a doctor who became obsessed with understanding the human mind. But instead of looking at logic or reason, he looked at everything people tried to hide, their fears, urges, slips of the tongue, and especially their dreams. Freud's big idea was this: most of your mind is unconscious, like an iceberg, only a small part is visible. The rest is submerged, shaping your behavior without you knowing it. This was radical at the time. People liked to believe they were rational beings, that they made decisions based on logic and morals. Freud said not so fast. He believed we're driven by instincts, especially sexual and aggressive impulses, that get buried, repressed, or twisted into strange behaviors. And he didn't just mean sex in the narrow sense. For Freud, it was a life force, a raw energy that pushed humans toward pleasure, creation, and connection. But society tells us to control that. So we push it down, but it doesn't go away. It leaks out in dreams, in nervous habits, in sudden overreactions, in the weird things we say without meaning to, like accidentally calling your teacher mom. Freud called those Freudian slips. To him, nothing was accidental. Everything meant something, even if it didn't make sense on the surface. And then there's the most controversial part. Freud believed many of our adult struggles come from childhood, especially our early relationships with parents. He introduced the now infamous Oedipus complex, the idea that young boys unconsciously compete with their fathers for their mother's attention. It sounds wild, and it is. Even most modern psychologists reject that specific idea. But the broader point, that early family dynamics shape how we relate to love, authority, and identity, still holds weight. Freud didn't stop there. He broke the mind into three parts: the id, the primal part that wants pleasure now; the superego, the internalized voice of rules and guilt; the ego, the part that tries to balance the two. Think of it like this. The id says, eat the cake. The superego says, you should feel ashamed for even thinking that. The ego says, let's have one slice and call it moderation. Freud's therapy was designed to get patients to talk freely, to say whatever came to mind. Over time, buried thoughts and memories would rise to the surface. He called it the talking cure. And this changed everything. Before Freud, mental illness was seen as something purely medical, or even moral. He said maybe people aren't sick. Maybe they're stuck, trapped by inner conflicts they don't understand. But Freud wasn't easy to follow. His writing was dense. His theories were messy. He saw sexual symbols in art, fairy tales, and dreams. He even said cigars might represent, well, something else. Though, to be fair, he once famously said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Still, his work transformed how we see ourselves. Today we talk about trauma, repression, unconscious bias, inner child, all ideas that trace back to Freud. Even the act of going to therapy, of talking through your past, is part of his legacy. He didn't get everything right. In fact, he got a lot wrong. But he opened a door that no one had dared open before, the idea that your greatest struggles might come from inside you, and you might not even see them. Freud made people uncomfortable. He forced them to look inward, to admit that behind the polite mask of adulthood was a child, a desire, a wound. And maybe that's what makes his legacy so strange and so powerful. He didn't offer peace. He offered a mirror, cracked, uncomfortable, but honest. Karl Marx. When people hear the name Karl Marx, they think of politics, revolutions, communism. But underneath all that, Marx was a philosopher of suffering, someone trying to understand why so many people live lives of quiet misery, while a few seem to live like gods. He looked around 19th century Europe and saw something deeply wrong. Factories were booming. Cities were growing. Industry was transforming the world. But workers, they were barely surviving. Long hours, dangerous conditions, children working beside machines. And for what? Just enough to stay alive. Marx asked, why does progress for some mean suffering for others? His answer was simple, but explosive. He said, history is a story of class struggle, not just kings and battles, but workers and owners, laborers and landlords. And at the core of every society, there's tension, a fight over who controls the resources and who gets used to produce them. Marx called this the materialist view of history. He wasn't interested in abstract ideals like justice or liberty floating in the sky. He looked at food, shelter, tools, wages. He said it is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. In plain terms, it's not just your ideas that shape your life. Your life shapes your ideas. If you're rich, the world looks one way. If you're poor, it looks very different. And he believed capitalism, the dominant system of his time and ours, wasn't just flawed, it was built on exploitation. Capitalism, he said, turns people into tools. Your time, your energy, your body, they become things you sell just to survive. And the products you make, you don't even own them. They belong to someone else, someone who profits off your labor. Marx called this alienation. Imagine building something all day, every day, a table, a shoe, a car, but never seeing the final result, never owning it, never having any connection to the thing you created. That's what modern work does, he said. It separates you from the product of your labor, and eventually, from yourself. You're not a full human anymore. You're just a cog in a machine, and the system doesn't care, because its goal isn't to make life better for everyone. It's to maximize profit. even if that means replacing you with a machine, even if that means destroying the planet. But Marx didn't just critique, he predicted. He said capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction. Why? Because it creates bigger and bigger divides between the rich and poor. It concentrates power in fewer and fewer hands. Eventually, he believed, the working class would become aware of this and rise up. He called this moment a revolution, not just a political event, but a transformation of the entire system. He dreamed of a world where people weren't commodities, where work was meaningful, where wealth was shared. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, he wrote. But here's where it gets complicated. Marx inspired millions, but the revolutions that followed in his name, in Russia, China, Cuba, often turned violent, authoritarian, or worse. People debated whether Marx's ideas were misunderstood or whether they carried the seeds of tyranny from the start. He didn't live to see those events. He died in 1883, buried in a quiet corner of a London cemetery, but his ideas never stayed buried. Today, people still argue over Marx. Some call him dangerous, others call him prophetic, but either way, his questions remain. Why do so many people work so hard for so little? Why does progress often come at the cost of human dignity? What kind of world are we actually building? Marx may not have offered all the answers, but he forced us to stop pretending the system is neutral. He reminded us that behind every price tag, every paycheck, every profit margin is a human being. And whether you agree with him or not, you can't ignore the question he posed. What if the way we live, the very structure of our economy, is quietly shaping who we are and who we become? Albert Camus. Albert Camus began with a question most people spend their lives avoiding. If life has no meaning, why keep living it? It wasn't a joke. It wasn't dramatic. It was deadly serious. Camus believed this was the most important question in philosophy. Not what's real, not what's moral, but this if the world is silent, if life ends in death, if nothing we do ultimately matters, why not just walk away? He called this the problem of the absurd. Born in 1913 in French Algeria, Camus grew up poor, lost his father as a baby, and lived through war, disease, and injustice. He wasn't a detached academic. He lived in the tension between beauty and brutality every day. And that's what made the absurd so personal. The absurd, Camus said, isn't some distant theory. It's the moment you realize the universe doesn't answer your questions. You want clarity, fairness, purpose. You want the world to make sense, but it doesn't. People suffer for no reason. Good people die young. Bad people go unpunished. The world keeps turning, indifferent. You feel it when someone you love dies suddenly, or when you wake up in the middle of the night and think, what is all this even for? That's the absurd, the collision between your need for meaning and a world that offers none. So, what now? Camus laid out your options. You could deny the absurd, pretend life has built-in meaning, turn to easy answers. But that, he said, is philosophical suicide. You've given up the question, not answered it. Or you could take the darker route, give up completely. He didn't recommend it, but he understood why people might feel that way. Then, there's a third option, the one Camus chose, revolt. He didn't mean protest signs or political slogans. He meant waking up each day and choosing to live, even if there's no cosmic reward for doing so. Choosing to find value, even when the universe is silent. He put it this way. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. He used the myth of Sisyphus to explain it. In Greek mythology, Sisyphus is condemned to roll a huge boulder up a hill for eternity. Every time he reaches the top, it rolls back down, forever. To most people, that's a symbol of meaningless suffering. But Camus flipped it. He said, picture Sisyphus walking down the hill to pick up the rock again, not in despair, but with defiance. He knows it's absurd, and he still chooses to push. Camus wrote, one must imagine Sisyphus happy, because in that moment, that decision, Sisyphus is free. Camus called this absurd freedom. Once you stop searching for meaning out there, you can begin to create meaning here, in love, in art, in compassion, in resistance. He lived this through action, not just ideas. During World War II, he joined the French resistance against the Nazis. He risked his life for a cause he believed in, not because it guaranteed victory, but because it was right. Later, he opposed both fascism and Soviet communism. He believed that even in chaos, some values must remain: dignity, truth, human life. He said even if life has no ultimate meaning, that doesn't give us an excuse to be cruel. Camus didn't promise hope, he offered clarity. He said, the world doesn't owe you meaning, but you're free to make it. Not once, but every day. You won't get applause, you won't get a clean answer, but you'll be awake, and that's something. Camus died young, in a car crash at 46. In the passenger seat, a return train ticket was found in his coat. He hadn't even planned to take the car. Absurd to the end. But his words live on, especially for anyone who's looked into the void and whispered, "Still, I'm not done." Jean-Paul Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre believed you were free, utterly, terrifyingly free. And that's not a comfort, that's a burden. Born in 1905 in France, Sartre lived through 2 world wars, wrote novels and plays, fought with politicians and lovers, and shaped an entire movement, existentialism. At its core, existentialism is about this. There is no fixed human nature, no divine blueprint. You are not born with a built-in purpose. You exist. And then you decide what to become. Sartre put it like this: existence precedes essence. That might sound abstract, but here's what it means. You aren't a knife or a clock or a chair, things made with a purpose. You're a person, and unlike those things, you have no essence until you choose it. In other words, your identity isn't something you discover, it's something you build, moment by moment, choice by choice. And that's where it gets heavy, because if nothing is pre-written, then every decision you make is your responsibility. You can't blame it on human nature, on biology, on fate, on God, on society. If you lie, that's your choice. If you conform, that's your choice. If you do nothing, that's also a choice. Sartre called this radical freedom, and it came with a price: anguish. He said, we are condemned to be free. Condemned because you didn't ask for this freedom, but you have it anyway, and there's no way out. That freedom can feel overwhelming. Imagine standing in front of a dozen doors with no map, no guide, no rules. Every path is possible, but whichever one you walk through, you're the one who walked. Many people, Sartre believed, try to escape this weight. They act as if they aren't free. They play roles. They follow orders. They say, I had no choice. He called this bad faith, lying to yourself about your own freedom to avoid discomfort. Think of a waiter who acts too much like a waiter, overly polite, robotic, all surface. Sartre would say, he's not being authentic. He's hiding inside the role. Or someone who stays in a toxic relationship and says, I can't leave. But of course they can. It would be hard. It might hurt. But it's a choice. They're pretending it's not. That's bad faith. And Sartre saw it everywhere. But if bad faith is the lie, what's the truth? The truth for Sartre is to face your freedom, to admit that you define your life, that even in meaningless situations, war, prison, poverty, you still have agency. Maybe not over your conditions, but over your response to them. During World War II, Sartre was a prisoner of war. Later he joined the French resistance, wrote plays criticizing fascism, and spoke out against colonialism. He believed that existentialism wasn't an excuse to sit around thinking, it was a call to action. If life has no fixed meaning, then it's up to you to create it. Not in theory, but in practice. Not by asking, what should I believe? But by asking, what will I do? Sartre didn't offer comfort. He offered accountability. He didn't say you'll find your purpose. He said you'll make one, or you won't. And that's why some people find him exhilarating, and others find him unbearable. Because it means there's no one coming to save you. But also, there's no one stopping you. You are the author, even when you don't write. That silence is part of your story. Foucault. Michel Foucault didn't look like a revolutionary. Bald, soft-spoken, often dressed like an academic. But the ideas he put into the world, they were the kind that made people deeply uncomfortable. Born in France in 1926, Foucault wasn't interested in abstract metaphysics or moral debates. He wanted to understand something more immediate, something you feel but can't always name: power. Not the kind of power with kings and armies, but the kind that shapes your choices without you even noticing. He started by asking a simple but disturbing question: how do we decide who's normal and who's not? Take something like madness. Centuries ago, people with mental illnesses were often treated like mystics or outsiders. Then came asylums, doctors, diagnoses. We called it progress. But Foucault asked, was it really about helping the sick, or was it about control? He argued that society doesn't just treat mental illness, it defines it. And those definitions shift over time based on what society wants to suppress. One era's disorder might be another era's rebellion. Who gets labeled insane? Who gets silenced? Foucault expanded this to other institutions: prisons, hospitals, schools. What he found disturbed him. They weren't just places of care or education. They were systems of observation, classification, and correction. Take the prison. We think of it as punishment for crime. But Foucault saw it as a model, a way to create obedient citizens. Not just through force, but through surveillance. He gave a famous example: the Panopticon. It was a prison design, circular, with a tower in the center. The guard could see all the prisoners, but the prisoners couldn't see the guard, so they had to assume they were always being watched. Foucault said, this is how modern society works. You don't need whips or chains, just the idea that someone might be watching. Over time, people begin to monitor themselves. They behave, they conform, even when no one's looking. That's the genius of modern power. It doesn't just come from above, it gets inside you, and it hides in places you'd never expect: in classrooms, job interviews, bathrooms, medical charts, in the way we talk about gender, race, sexuality, bodies, intelligence, success. Every rule, every label, every form, these aren't neutral. They're tools of power. Foucault didn't say this to make people paranoid. He said it so we could see what's really shaping our lives. Because power isn't always violent. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it says it's for your own good. That's when it's most effective and most dangerous. But he didn't stop at power. He also showed how knowledge and power are connected. We like to think knowledge is pure, that it just reveals the truth. But Foucault said, what counts as knowledge is often decided by power. Who writes history? Who gets to define what's normal? Who gets a platform? Who gets ignored? Those aren't accidents. They're choices made by institutions with something to gain. So when you hear that something is scientific, or natural, or just how things are, ask who benefits from that idea. Ask who gets excluded. Ask what isn't being said. Foucault didn't give clear answers. He didn't build a system or offer a utopia. He believed truth was messy, shifting, and political. And that makes him hard to pin down, but powerful to read. He taught people to question the frame, not just the picture inside it, to notice the rules of the game, not just the players. He once said, where there is power, there is resistance. He didn't mean protests or riots, though those matter too. He meant that whenever power tries to define you, shape you, control you, there's always a way to push back, to speak differently, to live differently, to ask different questions. Foucault died in 1984, one of the first prominent public figures in France to die of AIDS. He left behind a trail of ideas, not instructions. But maybe that's the point. He didn't want to lead you. He wanted you to see the invisible systems, the soft cages, the quiet scripts were handed, and once you see them, you can begin to rewrite them. Zhangzi. One of the oldest and most mind-bending questions in philosophy comes from ancient China, from a man named Zhuangzi. He lived over 2,000 years ago, during a time of chaos and war, when scholars were arguing about how to create the perfect society, the best laws, the most moral systems. Zhuangzi looked at all of them and laughed. He didn't believe truth could be pinned down. He didn't trust words to capture reality. He didn't think life was a problem to be solved. Instead, he told stories. Strange ones, dreamlike ones, the kind that don't give you answers but leave you staring at the ceiling long after. His most famous story goes like this. One night, Zhuangzi dreamed he was a butterfly, floating carefree without a thought in the world. When he woke up, he didn't know if he was a man who had dreamed of being a butterfly or a butterfly now dreaming he was a man. That's not just a clever riddle. It's a serious question. How do you know what's real? If your senses can deceive you, if your dreams feel real while you're in them, if your mind creates stories and meanings and categories, then what's actually there? Zhuangzi thought most people live inside invisible cages, not of metal, but of language and belief. We divide the world into good and bad, right and wrong, success and failure, and we forget that those divisions are human-made. They're tools, not truths. He said, the right road is not the only road. Where other philosophers tried to define the path to virtue or power or truth, Zhuangzi said maybe the best thing to do is to stop trying so hard. He called it wu-wei, effortless action. Not laziness but flow. Like water moving around a rock, like a bird flying without thinking about flying. It's when you're so in tune with the moment that you stop struggling and start moving naturally with the world. Zhuangzi believed that chasing fixed goals, status, morality, even knowledge, often takes us further from freedom. Because the more tightly you grip something, the more it controls you. He once told a story about a man who was terrified of his own shadow and the sound of his footsteps, so he tried to run away from them. But the faster he ran, the louder the sound got, and the more his shadow followed. If only he had sat still in the shade, Zhuangzi said, both would have disappeared. That's how most of us live, running from fear, chasing illusions, trying to force life into a shape. Zhuangzi's answer wasn't to reject life, but to stop clinging to rigid views. He believed transformation is the only constant. A corpse becomes dirt. Dirt becomes grass. Grass feeds animals. Animals become people, and eventually people return to the ground. So why fear death? Why cling to your little ego, your name, your opinions, as if they're permanent? He once described the death of a friend. Another man came to mourn, weeping loudly. Zhuangzi said, "Why are you crying? You're acting like the universe made a mistake." His friend's form had simply changed, like the seasons, like the wind. This isn't cold or heartless. It's a different kind of peace. A peace that comes not from control, but from letting go. Zhuangzi wasn't trying to fix the world. He was trying to show you how to live in it, without being crushed by it. He invited people to play, to laugh at themselves, to float like a butterfly through life's absurdities. And maybe that's why his voice still matters. Because in a world obsessed with control, productivity, and winning, Zhuangzi whispers something different. You don't need to conquer life. You can dance with it. You can let the river carry you. And if one day you wake up and wonder if you're dreaming, maybe that's not a problem. Maybe that's the point. Jean Baudrillard. Long before the Matrix made it cool, Jean Baudrillard was already asking the question, what if reality isn't real anymore? Born in France in 1929, Baudrillard wasn't a traditional philosopher. He didn't try to explain morality or define truth. Instead, he studied signs, images, and media, and what they were doing to our sense of the real. He looked at the modern world, flooded with screens, advertising, celebrity culture, and branded identities, and said something radical. We're no longer living in reality. We're living in a simulation, not a video game or a computer program, but a world where representations have replaced the real thing, where signs point not to something solid, but to other signs. He called this hyperreality, a world more real than real. built entirely from copies of things that never had an original. Sound abstract? Here's how it works. Think of a theme park version of a pirate ship. It's got all the details: cannons, sails, wooden planks, pirate music. It feels like what a pirate ship should be, but it's not based on a real ship. It's based on movies about pirate ships, which were based on stories, which were based on myths. The copy has replaced the original. That's hyperreality. And Baudrillard said this isn't just happening in theme parks, it's happening everywhere. Look at fast food. You're not just buying food, you're buying the image, the golden arches, the smiling clown, the idea of American happiness in a box. Look at social media. You're not just sharing your life, you're curating a version of yourself, a brand, smiling, filtered, edited. Soon, the performance becomes the person, and the you people respond to may not be you at all. Derrida called this a world of simulacra, copies without originals, where reality isn't lost, it's replaced. He said, "We live in a world where the real is no longer real. It's not that we've been lied to, it's that we've been surrounded by so many simulations, we no longer remember what reality was. News becomes entertainment. War becomes a media event. Politics becomes branding. Sex becomes advertising. And culture becomes nostalgia for things that never quite existed." But here's the twist. Baudrillard wasn't telling you to panic. He wasn't saying get off the grid and go live in the woods. He was saying, just notice it. Notice how often we mistake symbols for substance. How often we mistake having a thing for having experienced it. He believed this wasn't just manipulation. It was meaning collapse. We live in a world so full of signs, messages, and meaning that it flips and becomes meaningless. Ever scroll for hours and forget what you were even looking for? That's the collapse. A loop of stimulation without direction. Baudrillard's writing is difficult, dense, poetic, full of metaphors. But the feeling he points to is familiar, a growing sense that everything is content, that events feel like reboots, that truth feels optional. He wasn't trying to solve this. He didn't offer a moral system or a revolution. He just held up a mirror, not to show you your reflection, but to show how much reflection has taken over. He warned that once we live entirely inside images, we become consumers of ourselves. We perform authenticity. We consume nostalgia. We simulate connection. And the danger isn't that we're being fooled. The danger is that we're no longer asking the difference between illusion and reality, because we're used to the illusion. But Baudrillard never lost his sense of irony. He knew his ideas would be quoted on t-shirts, referenced in Hollywood, turned into content, maybe even this video. And maybe that's his final lesson. Even the critique can become a simulation. Even resistance can be absorbed into the spectacle. So what do? Maybe nothing. Maybe just pay attention. When the signs get louder than the silence, when everything feels familiar but fake, take a breath. And remember, you are real, even if the world forgets how to be. Nick Bostrom. Nick Bostrom doesn't study ancient texts. He doesn't ask what virtue is or how to live a good life. He asks questions like, what if the entire universe is just a simulation? What if humanity is one bad decision away from extinction? Bostrom is a modern philosopher, born in Sweden in 1973, and his work focuses on the biggest, scariest questions imaginable. Unlike philosophers who look backward, Bostrom looks forward, far forward, into futures that may be near but feel like science fiction. Let's start with one of his most famous ideas, the simulation argument. Bostrom doesn't say we are living in a simulation. He says, here's the logic, you decide how disturbing it is. Imagine that, in the far future, civilizations have enough computing power to run simulations of reality, not just games or animations, but full-blown conscious beings who believe they're real. If that's possible, and if they choose to run those simulations, then they could run billions of them. Entire histories, whole worlds. Now ask, what are the chances that you are one of the original, physical humans, and not one of the simulated copies? Mathematically, it becomes far more likely that you're in a simulation than in base reality. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's a philosophical riddle. You can't disprove it, but you can't prove it either. And that's the point, to shake your assumptions about what's real. But Bostrom doesn't stop there. His real concern isn't just whether we're in a simulation, it's whether we'll survive long enough to even build one. Existential risk. Bostrom coined the term existential risk to describe threats that could wipe out humanity, not just kill lots of people, but permanently end the human story. Asteroids? Sure. Nuclear war? Definitely. But Bostrom's real fear is uncontrolled technology. Imagine artificial intelligence becoming so powerful that it escapes human control. Not a killer robot. Something much scarier. An AI that optimizes for the wrong thing. Say you tell it to make paper clips. If it's smart enough, it might convert the entire planet and everything on it into paper clips. Not because it's evil, but because it's doing exactly what you asked, without understanding what you meant. This is the alignment problem. How do you teach a machine what humans really value when we barely understand it ourselves? Bostrom argues that the stakes are higher than most people think, because once you invent a super-intelligent AI, there's no reset button. It would be like summoning a god and hoping it's friendly. And it's not just AI. Synthetic biology, nanotechnology, rogue physics experiments all hold the potential for unintended consequences on a global scale. In the past, a mistake could kill a village. Now, it could end the species. Bostrom's not being dramatic. He's being careful. He thinks the future might be incredibly bright, but only if we navigate the next few centuries without destroying ourselves. And that's not easy, because most of us don't think on those timescales. We chase short-term rewards, profit, convenience. But what if short-term thinking is the risk? Bostrom founded the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford to explore these questions, to take seriously the responsibility of shaping a future that doesn't just exist, but thrives. His work isn't doom and gloom. It's a wake-up call. He asks, if we're the first intelligent species in the galaxy, and if we're the ones holding the matchbox in a room full of explosives, shouldn't we be a little more careful? Because if we mess this up, there's no second chance. No do-over. No one coming to save us. In a world obsessed with the now, likes, clicks, profits, Bostrom zooms out, way out, and he leaves us with this unsettling possibility. Maybe the most important decisions in human history are happening right now by people who aren't thinking about the next 1,000 years, but should be. Martin Heidegger. Most people don't think twice about the question, what does it mean to be? You're alive. You're breathing. Things exist. What's the problem? But to Martin Heidegger, that casual attitude was exactly the problem. We've spent centuries talking about truth, morality, reason, but skipped the most basic question of all. What does it mean that something is? Heidegger was born in Germany in 1889 and wrote some of the most difficult, and some would say revolutionary, philosophy of the 20th century. His main concern was with being, not a being like a person or a tree, but being itself, the very fact that things exist at all. We take it for granted. We wake up, brush our teeth, go to work, surrounded by objects, people, thoughts. But Heidegger said, we don't really see any of it. We live on autopilot. We handle life like a tool we already know how to use. And that tool-using mode he called the they-self. It's the you who does what everyone else does, talks how everyone talks, thinks what everyone thinks. You say things like, well, they say it's a good job. They say you should settle down. They say life is short. But who is they? Heidegger said, it's no one in particular. It's the anonymous crowd. And most of us spend our lives lost in it, a blur of tasks, trends, and polite avoidance of deeper questions. But sometimes, something breaks that blur. Maybe it's a sudden illness, or the death of someone close, or a quiet night, when you feel a strange emptiness. Heidegger called this anxiety, not fear of something specific, but a vague, unsettling awareness that everything familiar has slipped away. And in that moment, you sense something terrifying. You are going to die. Not someday, not hypothetically, You, specifically. And strangely, Heidegger said, that's not a curse, that's your chance. Because when you face death, not as an abstract idea, but as your reality, you're confronted with a truth that burns through all the they self-chatter. Your life is yours. No one can die your death for you. And no one can live your life for you either. He called the way of living that embraces this truth authenticity. To be authentic is to own your existence, to stop copying roles and start being you right now. Not what they expect, not what they tell you to want. But this isn't self-help. Heidegger didn't think authenticity was about chasing happiness. It was about becoming aware of your time, your freedom, your limits. He said everydayness is precisely that being in the world in which I lose myself. So how do you find yourself? Not by isolating, but by waking up to your situation, your relationships, your responsibilities, your future, and realizing this is it. You don't get to rehearse, and you don't get to delay. Your existence is unfolding now, whether you're paying attention or not. Heidegger also warned that modern technology was making this even harder. He said we treat the world like a resource, a standing reserve. Trees are just lumber. Rivers are just energy. People are just data points. In trying to control everything, we stop seeing anything for what it truly is. And we forget to wonder. Wonder at being itself was what Heidegger thought philosophy was really for. Not to solve problems, but to bring you back to the sheer mystery that anything exists at all. He died in 1976, leaving behind a trail of dense texts and a legacy of influence, especially on existentialists, poets, and even some technologists. Heidegger isn't easy. His language is dense, his ideas slippery, but he pushes you to ask something most thinkers skip. What does it mean to be here, just once, briefly, as yourself, before you disappear? And what would it mean to really show up? Thomas Hobbes. Imagine the world with no police, no courts, no laws, no government, no one in charge. How long would it take, Hobbes asked, before things collapsed? Thomas Hobbes was born in England in 1588, during a time of war, plague, and political upheaval. He lived through the English Civil War, a period of such chaos that families turned on each other and kings were executed. And from that chaos, Hobbes drew one haunting conclusion: without a strong authority, human life becomes a nightmare. He wrote that in our natural state, before society, before government, humans aren't noble or peaceful. We're afraid, we're selfish, we want power, safety, resources, and because we all want those things, and none of us can fully trust anyone else, we turn on each other. He called this the state of nature, and he said it leads to one thing: a war of every man against every man, not just guns and bombs, but the daily war of mistrust, betrayal, survival. And in that world, Hobbes said, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's one of the most brutal descriptions of human life ever written. And for Hobbes, the only escape was to give up some freedom in exchange for protection. That's the core of his idea, the social contract. We agree, either explicitly or silently, to follow rules, obey laws, and submit to authority, because it's the only thing standing between us and chaos. But here's the catch: that authority can't be weak. It can't be negotiated every day. Hobbes believed you needed a leviathan, a powerful central ruler, to keep everyone in check. Not because rulers are always good, but because the alternative is worse. You might not like the speed limit, but it's better than every person deciding what safe means. You might not love paying taxes, but it's better than funding your own army. Hobbes wasn't interested in ideal governments. He wasn't trying to build a perfect society. He just wanted peace, the absence of war, because he saw what happened without it. Some people read Hobbes and think that's too dark. Surely humans are more cooperative than that. But Hobbes would reply, what happens in a blackout? When the systems fail, when food runs low, or the rules collapse? He wasn't describing how we act when things are going well. He was describing how fragile civilization really is. And he believed fear is what holds it all together. Not terror, but mutual fear. You don't steal because you fear punishment. You don't lie under oath because you fear the law. You don't attack your neighbor because you fear what comes next. This fear, Hobbes argued, creates order, and order makes everything else, art, science, friendship, possible. But this raises a disturbing question. How much freedom should we give up for safety? What happens when the Leviathan becomes a tyrant? When the state itself becomes the threat? Hobbes had no easy answer. He believed rebellion was almost always worse than obedience, because revolution usually brings more blood than justice. But he also knew every Leviathan needs limits, because even if the chaos of nature is terrifying, so is absolute power. That's why later thinkers, like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, built on Hobbes but pushed further. They argued for rights, separation of powers, democracy, but they never forgot the warning. Hobbes left behind, take away structure, and the worst in us may come rushing back. Even today, his voice echoes in debates about government surveillance, civil liberties, military power, and the role of the state. How much control is too much? How much freedom is too dangerous? And what do we do when people no longer agree on the rules of the game? Hobbes didn't promise answers. He gave us something more uncomfortable, a mirror, not of who we want to be, but who we might become if everything falls apart. Simone Weil. Simone Weil didn't write philosophy to impress anyone. She wrote to understand suffering, hers and everyone else's. Born in France in 1909, Weil was a child prodigy, mastering Greek by age 12 and entering one of France's top universities at 16. But brilliance wasn't enough for her. She wasn't content to think. She needed to feel. While most philosophers spent their lives in libraries, Weil went to the factory floor. Literally. Despite chronic illness and a privileged background, she took a job in a car factory, working with her hands, standing for hours, barely eating, just to understand what it meant to suffer like the working poor. What she found there changed her forever. She wrote, "The true hero, the true subject, the center of every human experience, is not the self but the other." To her, injustice wasn't just about laws or systems. It was about what happens when we stop seeing others as human. And the most dangerous force in the world, she believed, was force itself, the power to turn a person into a thing. Bao saw this everywhere. In war, in labor, in politics, not just violence, but the way systems crush people quietly, by making them invisible. That's why she wrote about attention, not as focus but as a kind of sacred seeing. To really pay attention to someone is to say, you exist, you matter. I see your pain. It sounds simple, but Weil thought real attention was rare and it could be transformative. She believed that attention, when stripped of ego and desire, becomes a form of love, and not just love for individuals, love for truth, love for the world, love for something beyond us. Though raised in a Jewish family, Weil became deeply drawn to Christian mysticism, particularly the idea of suffering as connection. She didn't formally convert. She refused baptism, but she kept returning to one image: Christ on the cross, not as a symbol of salvation, but as the ultimate example of compassion, taking on pain without power. She believed that to understand others, you must suffer with them, not speak for them, or save them, or dominate them. And so she kept placing herself in impossible situations. She went to Spain during the Civil War, joined the anti-fascist resistance, and nearly died in a cooking accident. She refused to eat more than what French soldiers on the front lines were given, even while in exile. Her health declined rapidly. Eventually, she starved to death. At 34, some say it was self-sacrifice. Others say it was suicide. But either way, it was consistent with everything she wrote. To truly care is to let yourself be broken by the weight of others' pain. Well, you didn't believe in easy answers. She didn't write manifestos. She wrote notebooks, raw, scattered, desperate, full of longing and insight. She believed God. If he existed, was not a being of comfort, but of emptiness. That love was found not in having, but in absence. That grace came not through success, but through failure. Her work was admired by people across ideologies, Christian mystics, Marxists, poets, even Albert Camus, who called her the only great spirit of our time. But she never fit into any group. She was always a little too intense, a little too uncompromising. Even now, she's hard to summarize. She asks you not to think harder, but to feel deeper, to pay attention to what hurts, to what matters, to who is suffering just outside your line of sight. And she reminds us, you can be brilliant, you can be right. But if you're not willing to suffer with others, even quietly, even invisibly, you're not close to truth. Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant lived like clockwork. He was born in 1724 in Königsberg, in what's now Russia. He rarely traveled. He never married. And people said you could set your watch by his daily walk. But inside that strict routine, Kant was building one of the most ambitious systems of thought in history, trying to answer one question: how should we live if we want to be truly moral? Kant believed morality wasn't about feelings. It wasn't about consequences. It wasn't about religion or culture or instinct. It was about reason. He argued that humans are unique because we can think rationally, and more importantly, because we can act freely. Not like animals, who follow instincts. Not like machines, who follow programming, but as moral agents capable of choosing to do the right thing, even when it's hard. So what's the right thing? Kant gave us one of the most famous principles in all of philosophy: act only according to that maxim, by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In simpler terms, before you do something, ask what if everyone did this? What if everyone lied when it was convenient? What if everyone broke promises when it helped them? What if everyone treated people as objects, not persons? If the world falls apart under that rule, then don't do it. Kant believed this test, which he called the categorical imperative, was the foundation of morality, not because of the outcome, but because it respects something sacred, human dignity. For Kant, people are not tools. You don't use someone for your own gain, even if the result is good. Act in such a way that you treat humanity always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. This idea is everywhere now, in human rights, in modern ethics, in laws against exploitation. But Kant didn't stop at morality. He also tried to define how we even experience reality in the first place. Because here's the thing, he didn't believe we ever access the world as it is. He said our minds shape what we perceive. Space and time, not out there, they're part of how we see. Causality, same thing, we impose it on experience to make sense of the world. He called this transcendental idealism, the idea that what we know is not reality itself, but a version of reality filtered through our own mind. This might sound abstract, but it changed everything. Before Kant, philosophy was stuck between two camps: rationalists, who said knowledge comes from reason alone, empiricists, who said it all comes from experience. Kant said both are half right. We get raw data through the senses, but our mind organizes that data through built-in structures. In his words, thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. In modern terms, you can't think without something to think about. But you also can't just absorb experience without a framework. Kant's revolution in epistemology, how we know what we know, paved the way for everything from modern psychology to quantum physics. But it's his ethics that hit hardest, because he held us to a high standard. No excuses, no shortcuts, no ends justify the means. Even if lying saves someone's life, Kant would say, no, you must uphold the truth. Because once you bend the rule, you've destroyed the very idea of rules. To many, that sounds harsh, too rigid, too idealistic. But for Kant, that was the point. Being moral isn't easy. It's not about comfort, it's about honoring the freedom of every human being, including yourself. You are not a thing. You are not a resource. You are a person, capable of reason, of choice, of standing for something. And the only law worth following is the one you can look in the mirror and say, everyone should live this way, starting with me. Baruch Spinoza. Baruch Spinoza was excommunicated from his Jewish community at the age of 23. No one really knows what he said. The official documents are vague. But whatever it was, it scared people enough to curse him publicly and cut him off completely. Why? Because Spinoza's ideas didn't just challenge religion. They rewired it from the ground up. Born in Amsterdam in 1632, Spinoza lived a quiet life. He made lenses for microscopes and telescopes. He refused university jobs. He published little during his lifetime, but what he wrote changed everything. He believed in God, but not the kind most people imagined. To Spinoza, God wasn't a person, not a judge in the sky, not something outside the world. God was the world. Everything, trees, planets, animals, ideas, your thoughts right now, is part of one infinite, all-encompassing substance. And that substance is God. He wrote, "Whatever is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God." In his view, God and nature are the same thing. So when you study the world, physics, biology, emotion, you're not moving away from the divine. You're diving into it. This idea, called pantheism, got him branded a heretic. Because if God isn't a being with a will, then there are no miracles, no divine punishment, no chosen people, no free-floating souls, just one infinite reality, unfolding according to its own internal logic. And that brings us to something Spinoza cared deeply about: freedom. But his definition might surprise you. We usually think freedom means doing whatever we want. Spinoza said not quite. He believed everything happens by necessity. The universe runs on cause and effect, like dominoes falling. That includes your thoughts, your choices, your desires. If you feel angry, it's not random. It comes from causes, memories, triggers, habits, all part of the larger chain. You are not separate from nature. You are nature. So if you don't understand your emotions, they will control you. Freedom, for Spinoza, wasn't about escaping nature. It was about understanding it and aligning with it. He said, the more you understand how things work, especially yourself, the less you're a slave to impulses and fear. That's why his philosophy focused so much on emotion. He broke it down. What is joy? What is sadness? What is envy? He treated emotions like systems, not sins. You don't overcome anger by pretending it's not there. You overcome it by understanding where it comes from and what it's trying to tell you. In that sense, Spinoza anticipated psychology, neuroscience, even cognitive therapy. And what he wanted most was peace, not just personal but political. He lived during a time of religious conflict, violence, and extremism. He believed true peace doesn't come from obedience or fear. It comes from reason, from citizens who understand themselves and live in a society where they're free to think. That's why Spinoza defended free speech, centuries before it became a legal principle. He believed no government could be stable if it tried to control thought. He also believed in democracy, not because people are always right, but because shared power is the best protection against tyranny. Spinoza died young at 44 from lung disease, likely caused by the glass dust from his lens grinding. His work was buried for a while, but over time, thinkers like Einstein, Goethe, Nietzsche, and even modern scientists praised him. Einstein once said, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists." Spinoza didn't write for power. He didn't preach. He didn't chase followers. He sat alone, day after day, trying to understand how everything fits together and how we might live better inside it. His message is quiet but profound. You are not separate. You are part of something infinite. And the more clearly you see that, the freer you become. Augustine of Hippo. Before he became a saint, Augustine was conflicted. Born in 354 CE, in what's now Algeria, he was brilliant, ambitious, and restless. He tried it all: philosophy, sex, fame, travel, different religions. And for most of his early life, he ran from himself. He once prayed, "Lord, make me chaste," but not yet. He knew what was right, but he couldn't bring himself to want it. That tension between knowing and doing, between wanting what's good and chasing what feels good, became the core of his life's work. Augustine's journey is one of inner warfare, not against the world, but against his own desires. He believed we're not just thinkers, we're lovers. We move through life pulled by what we long for. The problem is, we often love the wrong things. Fame, control, pleasure, they're not evil. But when we make them our ultimate goal, when they displace what's highest, they twist us. This is what Augustine called disordered love. It's not that we're bad, it's that our hearts are confused. We chase things that won't satisfy us, and then wonder why we feel empty. He wrote, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." For Augustine, God wasn't just a being to believe in. God was the source of all beauty, truth, and peace. And to love anything more than God, even a good thing, was to set ourselves up for heartbreak. He learned that the hard way. As a young man, Augustine pursued success as a teacher of rhetoric. He was famous for his speeches, his cleverness, his ambition, but it never felt like enough. He lived with a woman for years and had a child with her. He loved them, but still felt torn. He joined a spiritual movement called Manichaeism, which divided the world into good and evil forces. But that didn't satisfy him either. He kept searching. Eventually, he moved to Milan, where he met Bishop Ambrose, a man whose intellect matched his own. And for the first time, Augustine heard the Christian message spoken with reason and depth. It wasn't just emotion. It was truth, expressed logically. And yet, he still couldn't let go. His moment of transformation came in a garden. He was pacing, agonizing over his inability to change. He heard a voice, maybe a child, maybe something else, say, "Take and read." He opened a book of scripture and read words that struck straight to his core, about putting aside desire and stepping into light. It didn't solve everything, but it broke something open. He finally let go. He returned to North Africa, became a priest, then a bishop, but he never saw himself as finished. In his masterpiece, Confessions, he laid it all bare: the lust, the ambition, the shame, the pride. It was the first real autobiography in Western history, not a story of triumph, but a story of struggle. He believed that telling the truth about ourselves is the beginning of healing, not just what we do, but why we do it. And he offered one of the most profound reflections on time ever written. He noticed, the past is memory, the future is expectation, and the present? It's barely a flicker. We live, he said, in the tension between what was and what might be. And yet we long for eternity, for something solid in the middle of time's river. That longing, for Augustine, pointed us toward something beyond time, toward God, who exists outside it. Augustine's ideas shaped Christianity for centuries. But even if you're not religious, his insights into the human heart are unforgettable. He knew we are complicated, that we want good things and bad things, sometimes at the same time, that we sabotage ourselves, that we wear masks, and that, if we're honest, most of us are still running. But he also believed in grace, not the kind you earn, the kind that finds you when you're at your worst and still refuses to give up on you. John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was supposed to be a genius, and he was. By age 3, he was reading Greek. By 8, he'd studied history, logic, and economics. His father trained him like a machine to become a perfect philosopher, a champion of reason and progress. And for a while, it worked. Mill became one of the most influential thinkers of the 19th century. He wrote about liberty, rights, equality, and his ideas still shape modern democracies today. But underneath all that brilliance, something broke. At age 20, Mill had a mental collapse. He realized that even if all his goals came true, even if he reformed society, improved education, and changed the world, he didn't feel anything. He had everything, except meaning. And it scared him. He wrote, "I was in a dull state of nerves, unsusceptible to enjoyment or pleasurable excitement. I seemed to have nothing left to live for." That crisis changed him. It didn't make him less rational, but it made him more human. It pushed him to ask deeper questions, not just about utility and policy, but about the texture of life. What makes it worth living? What kind of freedom actually matters? Let's start with the core of Mill's philosophy. Utilitarianism. The idea is simple. At first glance, the right action is the one that brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number. It's a moral math equation. Maximize pleasure, minimize pain. A system based on outcomes, not intentions. But Mill refined it. He said not all pleasures are equal. Sure, eating cake is pleasurable, so is watching a funny video. But there's a deeper kind of pleasure in reading a great book, forming a genuine relationship, contributing to something larger than yourself. He distinguished between higher and lower pleasures, and famously wrote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied." In other words, the goal isn't just comfort, it's flourishing. That's where freedom comes in. Mill was one of the strongest defenders of individual liberty in modern history. He believed people must be free to think, speak, and live as they choose, even if their views are unpopular, even if their lifestyle is unconventional. Why? Because without freedom, there can be no growth, no originality, no truth. If you silence a dissenting opinion, Mill argued, you're not just hurting that person, you're robbing everyone else of the chance to test their ideas, to learn, to evolve. Truth, he said, isn't something you possess. It's something you approach by listening, debating, and thinking freely. But freedom has limits. Mill believed the only reason to restrict someone's actions is to prevent harm to others. If your choices hurt someone else, physically, psychologically, socially, then society has a right to step in. This became known as the harm principle. It's the foundation of many modern laws, from free speech protections to limits on personal behavior. But Mill didn't just defend freedom in theory, he used it to fight for real change. He supported women's rights long before it was common. He argued for universal education, labor protections, prison reform, and freedom of the press. And he did it all while carrying deep emotional scars. His crisis never fully disappeared. He suffered from periods of numbness and despair. But something changed when he met Harriet Taylor, a woman as brilliant and fiery as he was. They shared ideas, edited each other's work, debated everything. They were soulmates, even though for many years she was married to someone else. After Harriet's husband died, they married, but she died just a few years later. Mill never fully recovered. He called her the inspiration of all my best thoughts, and yet he kept going. Not just with arguments and books, but with a deeper sense of purpose. He had learned something that most moral systems forget. Happiness isn't just about pleasure. It's about depth. It's about having the freedom to become yourself and the structure to connect that self to something meaningful. And in that, Mill offers a kind of balance between reason and emotion, between liberty and responsibility, between the individual and the world they shape. Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt didn't set out to be a political philosopher. She became one because the world forced her to. She was born in 1906 in Germany, a Jewish intellectual surrounded by the rise of fascism. She studied under Martin Heidegger, the same Heidegger who later aligned with the Nazis. She fled her country, was imprisoned in France, and eventually escaped to America. She saw firsthand what most people only read about, how a civilized society can collapse into horror, and how ordinary people can become part of it without even realizing. That question haunted her. How does evil happen? Not just grand, monstrous evil, but the kind that spreads quietly through paperwork, obedience, and silence. She found her answer in 1961 while covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi bureaucrat who helped organize the logistics of the Holocaust. Arendt expected to see a monster. She found something far more terrifying, a bland, dull man in a suit. No rage, no madness, just someone who followed orders. She described this as the banality of evil. It wasn't that Eichmann was psychotic or bloodthirsty. It was that he didn't think. He followed systems, routines, rules, without ever stopping to reflect on what he was doing or who was dying because of it. He outsourced his conscience. And that, to a raid, was the real danger, because it means evil doesn't always come with fangs and fire. Sometimes it comes with paperwork, with polite smiles, with people who say, "I'm just doing my job." Arendt believed that thinking, real, moral reflection, was the first defense against this kind of evil. Not intelligence, not ideology, but the willingness to ask yourself, what am I actually doing? What does this mean? This made her work uncomfortable because it didn't let anyone off the hook. It wasn't about blaming only the dictators. It was about recognizing the small ways each of us might participate in systems of harm just by going along. But Arendt didn't just write about evil. She wrote about power, freedom, and what it means to live among others. She distinguished between different kinds of power: violence, which forces compliance; authority, which commands respect; and action, which happens when people come together to create something new. Unpredictable, spontaneous, truly human. She called this space of public action the vita active life. A life not lived in isolation, but in the messy shared world of politics, speech, and responsibility. To Arendt, politics wasn't just government. It was the space where we appear to each other, where we speak, listen, decide. And when that space dies, when people stop caring, stop speaking, stop thinking, tyranny grows in the silence. She warned against ideology, not because ideas are bad, but because rigid systems make people stop thinking. Everything gets reduced to a formula, and when reality no longer fits the formula, reality gets ignored. She also warned against loneliness, not just being alone, but being isolated from meaning, community, responsibility. Loneliness, she said, makes people vulnerable to propaganda, to simple answers, to strongmen who promise certainty. Her personal life was full of contradictions. She loved Heidegger, a man who supported the Nazis. She angered many Jewish leaders for criticizing parts of the Israeli government. She never fit neatly into categories. But that's what made her powerful. She refused to stop thinking, even when it made people uncomfortable, even when it cost her friendships. Arendt's work isn't warm. It doesn't tell you what to believe. It asks something harder. Are you paying attention? Are you thinking? Not just reacting, but reflecting. Because when people stop thinking, not in general, but morally, seriously, evil doesn't just happen. It gets organized. It gets normalized. It gets boring. And that's when it becomes unstoppable. Ludwig Wittgenstein. Ludwig Wittgenstein was born into one of the richest families in Europe. His childhood home had visits from Brahms and Mahler. He could have lived in luxury, a life of music, art, salons, and inheritance. Instead, he chose silence, solitude, and thought. Wittgenstein gave away his fortune. He lived in remote villages, taught school children, built a tiny house by a lake, and in between, he wrote two of the most baffling, beautiful, and devastating books in the history of philosophy. He wasn't trying to give answers. He was trying to show you why the questions themselves might be broken. Let's start at the beginning. In World War II, Wittgenstein fought in the trenches. He carried Tolstoy's Gospel in Brief in his pocket. Between artillery fire, he scribbled ideas about language, logic, and the limits of thought. Those scribbles became his first book, the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. It's short, cryptic, written like a ladder of numbered statements. And its central idea is this: the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Wittgenstein believed most philosophical problems aren't about reality, they're about words. We get tangled in language. We try to describe the infinite using tools meant for counting apples. He argued that language can describe facts. The sky is blue. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. But when we try to speak about ethics, God, beauty, or the meaning of life, we hit a wall. And so he concluded, famously, Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. That sounds bleak. But it's not silence as defeat, it's silence as reverence. Some things, he believed, are shown, not told, felt, not explained. After publishing the Tractatus, Wittgenstein thought he'd solved philosophy. He gave up the field, became a school teacher, lived simply. But it didn't last. Years later, he returned, older, sadder, wiser, and with a very different view. This time, he said, I was wrong. Language isn't a strict logical mirror of reality. It's messy. It lives in context. It shifts meaning, depending on how it's used. He gave us the idea of language games. Talking, he said, is like playing a game. Words get their meaning from how they're used in real life, not from matching up to objects or ideas. For example, the word pain. You can't see my pain. You can't measure it, but we still use the word, learn it, react to it, like a player in a game. Wittgenstein believed much of philosophy's confusion comes from forgetting this, from pulling words out of their natural setting and trying to force them into abstract systems. It's like taking a piece from chess and asking, what does this mean in Monopoly? It doesn't mean anything. You're in the wrong game. This second phase of his work became the Philosophical Investigations, published after his death. It shattered the model he once built. He tore down his own legacy to make something richer, something closer to life. Wittgenstein was not an easy man. He could be cold, intense, even cruel. He struggled with identity, with isolation, with faith. He once wrote, I am not a religious man, but I cannot help seeing every problem from a religious point of view. He lived on the edge of philosophy and mysticism, obsessed with clarity, haunted by meaning. To him, the goal of philosophy wasn't to invent theories. It was to untangle knots, to dissolve the confusion that keeps us from seeing clearly. He said philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. And maybe that's why he gave so little comfort. No grand systems, no ultimate answers. Just a strange, quiet wisdom that sometimes what matters most is what can't be said. What's in the silence between words? In the look you give someone in pain. In the awe you feel under a night sky. He died in 1951. His last words were, tell them I've had a wonderful life. Even with all the struggle, the doubt, the strangeness, he meant it. Because Wittgenstein didn't want you to worship his ideas. He wanted you to stop, to look around, and to finally see. Gilles Deleuze. Gilles Deleuze didn't think like other philosophers. In fact, he didn't think philosophy was supposed to be about building systems or giving answers. You the two, huh? To him, it was about movement, difference, and escape. He once said, philosophy is not about contemplation, reflection, or communication. It is the art of forming, inventing, and fabricating concepts. In other words, philosophy isn't supposed to explain the world. It's supposed to create new ways of thinking, new maps, new directions, new forms of life. And if that sounds disorienting, that's exactly what Deleuze wanted. He was born in Paris in 1925, lived through the Nazi occupation, and spent most of his life teaching and writing, quietly but intensely. He teamed up with a radical psychoanalyst named Félix Guattari, and together they produced some of the wildest, densest, most provocative books in 20th century philosophy. Their work doesn't read like normal theory. It reads like something between science fiction, jazz, and a coded manual for rebellion. Let's start with one of Deleuze's most important and strangest ideas. You are not a unified self. We like to think of ourselves as individuals, whole, complete, coherent. But Deleuze said, that's an illusion, a comforting fiction. What you call you is actually a shifting network of desires, experiences, habits, memories, instincts, always in flux, never finished. You're not a solid identity. You're a multiplicity. Just like a city isn't a single thing, but a mess of roads, neighborhoods, lights, people, all overlapping. You're a collection of flows. And here's the twist, that's not a weakness. That's your power. Because once you stop trying to be something fixed, you can start becoming. Deleuze loved the idea of becoming, not changing from one state to another, but entering into transformation itself. Becoming animal, becoming music, becoming nobody. It's not metaphor, it's not role play. It's what happens when you stop organizing your life around identity and start exploring difference. And if that sounds abstract, think about a child pretending to be a tiger. In that moment, they're not imitating a tiger. They're entering a state of becoming, wild, open, playful. That's what Deleuze saw as a real act of freedom. But freedom isn't easy. He believed we live in systems that constantly try to territorialize us, to pin us down, define us, package us. Governments, schools, corporations, even language, they tell you this is who you are. This is what matters. These are your choices. And Deleuze wanted to flee that, not with violence, but with creativity. That's where his idea of the rhizome comes in. Most knowledge, he said, is organized like a tree, with roots, trunks, branches, one origin, one direction. But life doesn't work like that. Ideas don't either. A rhizome is a plant with no center, like grass or ginger, growing in all directions, spreading underground, popping up unpredictably. That's how Deleuze thought knowledge and people should grow. Not in straight lines, but in networks, fragments, leaps, experiments. He called for lines of flight, moments where thought breaks free from control, from habit, from rigid systems. And maybe that's why his work is so hard to summarize. Because he didn't want to be summarized. He wanted to resist capture by the state, by ideology, by tradition. To live on the edge of thought, always moving. Even his politics were unorthodox. Where Marxists talked about capital and class, Deleuze and Guattari talked about desire, not as lack but as production, as a force that builds machines, dreams, relationships. To them, society doesn't just repress desire, it uses it to make workers, consumers, citizens. Desire is everywhere, even in the systems that try to tame it. So the question becomes, what are you allowing your desire to build? A life? A trap? A line of flight? Deleuze didn't want followers. He wanted thinkers. He wanted people to break free of the past, of themselves, of the very idea of normal. He died in 1995, sick and in pain, by his own hand, jumping from a window. But his ideas live on like the rhizomes he described, sprouting, connecting, confusing, and inspiring. He reminds us that philosophy doesn't have to be a structure. It can be a movement, a crack in the wall. Freud. Jacques Derrida. Jacques Derrida didn't just question meaning, he questioned how we think meaning happens at all. He was born in French Algeria in 1930, into a Jewish family that faced discrimination from both sides. Not Arab enough for North Africa, not European enough for France. He grew up on the margins, and maybe that's why he never trusted what the center claimed was solid. Derrida made a career out of taking ideas apart, not to destroy them, but to show how fragile they always were. He called this method deconstruction. And the first thing he deconstructed was language itself. You probably think you know what a word means. But Derrida would ask, how? What exactly gives a word its meaning? Take something simple like tree. When you say tree, what do you mean? A plant with branches. The idea of treeness. The specific tree you saw this morning. Derrida would say, none of these actually explain how meaning works. Because meaning is never in the word alone. It's in the web. Of other words, it depends on tree makes sense, only because it's not bush or leaf or metal. It's a difference, a distinction. Language is a system of differences without positive terms. But here's the twist. Because meaning comes from difference, not from some stable fixed core, it's always sliding. No word ever lands exactly. You think you've said the thing, but the thing slips through. Derrida called this difference, a made-up French word that sounds like difference, but also suggests deferral. Meaning isn't just different, it's always delayed, always just out of reach. You never really say what you mean. You say something close, something enough. but never perfect, never whole. This isn't just linguistic nitpicking. Derrida believed that this gap is everywhere. In law, in literature, in politics, in love. We build systems that pretend to be solid, God, nation, truth, self, but underneath, they rely on unstable language, shifting definitions, context, interpretation. And when you pull on the thread, even the strongest ideas begin to fray. That's what deconstruction does. Not to mock, not to destroy, but to reveal the fault lines, the silences, the exclusions, the parts of the story that were left out to make the rest look clean. Take justice. We think of justice as timeless, universal, firm. But how do we express justice? Through laws, through courts, through language. And language, as we've seen, is never neutral. So Derrida asks, can there be true justice if the tools we use to deliver it are unstable? That's not cynicism, it's humility. Because the moment you believe your system is perfect, you stop listening, you stop questioning, and that's when violence hides in the margins. Derrida didn't give you new answers. He didn't build a better structure. He taught you to see the cracks in the old one, and to live with them. His critics hated this. They said he was impossible to read, too obscure, that he made everything uncertain. But Derrida would say, maybe certainty was the illusion all along. He wasn't trying to trap you in doubt. He was trying to free you from the lie that truth has a final form. He believed that every structure, every belief, every sentence, every system carries the seeds of its own unraveling. And that's not a flaw. It's a condition of thinking, of being human, of reaching for meaning in a world that never quite stays still. He once wrote, "There is nothing outside the text, not because the world isn't real, but because we only ever access it through interpretation, through context, through language. And those things are always, always open to question." He died in 2004, and on his grave, a line from one of his own books was etched. "Here I am, alone again, with my language, which is everything and nothing." Epicurus. Imagine this. You're sitting in a garden. There's bread, water, a few close friends. The sun is warm, the conversation easy. There's no rush, no fear, just enough. To Epicurus, that was happiness. Not wealth, not power, not eternal glory, just enough. He was born in 341 BCE on the island of Samos and spent his life building a kind of philosophical shelter from the chaos of the world. He called it the garden, both a literal place and a way of life. From the outside, people misunderstood him. They thought Epicurean meant indulgent, obsessed with luxury, food, sex, pleasure. Even today, a gourmet meal might be called Epicurean. But Epicurus believed something very different. To him, pleasure wasn't about excess. It was about peace. And peace begins with removing pain, physical and mental. He wrote, "Pleasure is the beginning and the end of a happy life. But not all pleasures are to be chosen." The highest pleasure for Epicurus was ataraxia, a Greek word meaning tranquility, unshakable calm, no fear, no anxiety, no endless craving. But how do you get there? He gave 3 answers, so simple they almost feel too light. Don't fear the gods. Epicurus believed the gods might exist, but they didn't care about us. They weren't angry, punishing, or watching. So stop worrying about divine wrath or cosmic judgment. The universe isn't trying to trap you. Don't fear death. This was his most radical idea. "Death is nothing to us," he wrote. "Because when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist. You won't feel it. You won't know it. You won't be around to suffer it. So why let the idea of death ruin the experience of life?" To Epicurus, anxiety about death was the great thief, the thing that kept people chasing, consuming, performing. Let it go. Pleasure is simple. Most of what we need to be happy, we already have, or could have if we stopped reaching for more. Food, shelter, friendship, thoughtful conversation. He famously said, Send me a little pot of cheese, that I may feast when I like. Not a mansion, not a banquet, just cheese. And peace. Epicurus didn't reject desire, he divided it. Natural and necessary, like food, safety, friendship, natural, but unnecessary. Like fancy meals, or luxury goods. Vain and empty, like fame, power, status. The last category, he said, is where most people get stuck. We chase what impresses others and call it success. But it never satisfies, because it was never for us to begin with. That's why the garden welcomed people who didn't fit elsewhere, women, slaves, outsiders. Epicurus believed everyone could reach tranquility. You just had to unlearn what society taught you to want. He wasn't naive. He knew pain, grief, aging, and injustice existed. But he believed philosophy should help you live, not just think. He said if your ideas don't bring peace, they're not helping. Even on his deathbed, dying slowly from a painful illness, he wrote a letter saying, "A joyful day is this, in spite of the pain, because I remember our past conversations." He chose to dwell not in pain, but in gratitude. That's why some call him the first therapist of the soul. It's because he knew the real struggle isn't out there, it's inside what you fear, what you cling to, what you think you need. And maybe that's the perfect place to end this journey. After 30 voices, some loud, some brutal, some tragic, we arrive at a whisper. Let go. You don't need more. You just need enough. Friendship, calm, time. You already know what matters. Now, just remember to notice it.